Okay, so the aim of today's workshop is to give you a basic education on what the impact of toxic stress is on the brain of both children, which then obviously carries on impacting onto adults. It's to raise awareness of adverse childhood experiences and the impact of trauma on our young people that we work with every day, and to give you an update regarding the early intervention project, which has just come to an end, and I've just received the evaluations from that just last weekend. So if you could just have a think with your partner next door for 2 seconds, just a bit of a warm-up. If you can name and roll your favourite TV programme when you were a child. So I'm going to give you a timer for this. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, so go, chat with your partner. Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Oh, yes. Now, you might be thinking, what's the purpose of this? Well, straight away, what I'm doing is basically taking you back in time for you to have a think about and take you right back to being what it was like as a child, sat in front of the television, maybe having a little sort of sick day home from school with a blanket over you watching your favourite programme. We all loved doing that when we were little. So it takes you back into thinking about your childhood, and straight away, almost those memories come flooding back. You can almost take yourself back. I can take myself back to Grange Hill on a tea time. I used to love that. And you can take yourself back to sort of watching Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Chips. So it's just a little bit about taking you back in time and making you think about what your childhood was making you think about. And that, obviously, we consider the information that we just discussed is very light-hearted stuff. But it's about keeping ourselves safe when we're talking about childhood and talking about taking your memories back, because for some children, that's an extremely traumatic time. So for some of us sitting there thinking of all the lovely things about our childhood, hopefully, but for some of our children, when they look back at their childhood later on in life, it's not going to be something that they're going to almost relish taking themselves back to. So it just gives you a little bit of thought about what our young people are actually experiencing. And then it takes us on to, well, what support have we got available for children who then become adults, who have to start thinking back at maybe some traumatic experiences that have happened, that have shaped the way that they've become. So the project, obviously, that I've been involved in is the early intervention and prompt positive action, and the whole purpose behind it was to break the generational cycle of crime. Obviously, a really easy task to try and do at the moment, as you can imagine. It was a 2-year programme piloted in Bridgend, and it was funded by the Peace Innovation Fund, and it was delivered by Public Health Wales, which is where I'm involved, NSPCC and Barnardo's, and it was just the Bridgend area, which is the area that you're actually in. It's an early intervention and prevention they realise is a priority for all public bodies, because at the moment we're all striving for a healthier, safer, more equal Wales. And the focus on the project was on the long-term health and social benefits of tackling the root causes of harm and adversity, instead of struggling to pick up the pieces, as we know, when it all gets far too late, which is tend to be, certainly in a comprehensive system, is when you start to see some really difficult episodes that are really sort of intergenerational, that start to carry on the cycle. So we look at equality and equity, and in schools we're very much always in the past have been there's been lots of words bandied about equality. All our children must be equal. Well, that's nonsense, because our children are not equal. They come from very different backgrounds. They come from loving, supportive backgrounds where they've had everything that you would want your children to have. The adult in that environment has been working with them from when they're babies. They've got a secure attachment to the mother or to the father. They've had nursery rhymes read to them. They've had numbers start to be introduced. They've been toilet trained. People have been taking them out to the boat, giving them lots of experiences. But sadly, obviously, as we know, that is not the case for all our children. We'd like it to be the case, but we need to be sensible and realise that our children do not all come from an equal background. They come from a really varied variety of situations, some much more unpleasant, obviously, than others. So what we're aiming for in raising ACE awareness in schools and ACE Informed is we're aiming for equity for our learners. So the little boy on the right-hand side that you can see, you can't see through the fence because he hasn't got the same sort of chances as the other two next door to him. With the equity slide next door, we can see that it's our job to actually give him the scaffolding in school and obviously in any environment that he's in, to give him the best chance so that at least he can see over the barrier like everybody else. And that's what I think we're all aiming for, certainly in Welsh schools at the moment. And I just want you to look at this particular scene at the moment and imagine that you are in a lovely leafy area, you're going for a walk, and basically you are enjoying yourself, the sun is out, hopefully this will be Easter weekend for us all, the trees, you can hear the birds, and you're really enjoying yourself and you're feeling really calm and really at ease. And then all of a sudden, that woke you all up this morning, didn't it? Straight away you hear that. Now obviously, luckily enough, we're not living in the wilds of Canada where we're expecting to see something coming round the corner that makes a noise such as that. But if you were, for example, walking down the path and you heard that in the distance, something would start to happen. There would be changes in your body that start to make you aware that there is danger ahead and there is something maybe coming out from maybe the bushes that you need to be aware of. And obviously, this is how friendly. He's even nastier the second time around because he's really, really annoyed and really grumpy. But basically, what we're talking about is that is a stressful situation, that you're in a calm environment 1 minute and then things start to alter. So I want you to think about how does that make you feel and what happens to your body if you're in a stressful situation such as that. Not that we're likely to be in with the bear in the woods, but what would your body start to do? Anybody like to sort of share? How does it make you feel? What happens, what changes happen to your body when you're in a stressful situation? Heart would start to race, yeah? Heart would start to, the beat would be much faster. Anything else? Short of breath, yeah? Feelings, yeah? Starting to get really stressed. Sweaty palms. Obviously starting to shake a little bit, stomach starts to get upset and starts to turn over. Anything like that that's in a stressful situation, your body reacts in a certain way, and that's natural because it's designed to keep you safe. Okay, those bodily instincts that happen, the changes in your body are designed to keep you safe, and they change just for that particular reason. Which leads us into the next slide, which is about the impact of stress, not just in children, but in adults, which we have to endure on a daily basis. And this is quite a good slide because it's got three, sort of a green, an amber, and a red. And if we think about the green being positive stress, this is mild and short-lived stress, which the response is required for healthy development. By that would mean things that we've all under stress, especially in a teaching role or a job in a school every day. We've got targets to meet, we've got people coming at us left, right and centre, we've got telephone calls, we've got emails coming in, and that stressful situation is our day-to-day lives. You might be rushing in the car in the morning and there's a big traffic jam and you've got to get to a meeting on time. So your body is designed to put up with positive stress on a daily basis. And that stress is a good thing because it helps us to meet our targets, it helps us to be successful in our lives, it helps us to obviously gain our achievements. If you were doing a driving test, you're obviously very stressful, but at the end of it, you would be able to drive. So that type of positive stress gets us to where we want to get to in life. The next box is tolerable stress. Now this is obviously sadly what all of us in our lives have at some point, which is obviously a different step up from positive stress, and tolerable stress is a much more severe stress response, but it's limited in time and it allows for recovery. So an example of that would be something like maybe a serious illness that's been diagnosed in your family. Somebody's sort of developed cancer or they've had a diagnosis, and obviously extremely upsetting time for the whole family. Lots of tolerable stress going on, but hopefully it's limited in time. You have the first upset where everything sort of is thrown up in the air, but things start to settle, and whether you have to then go to hospital and have treatment, but things do start to settle down, and we're hoping that it would allow for recovery and you would obviously recover. It doesn't happen all the time, sadly, but obviously that's one example. Another example would be things like if you were having problems with your partner and you were going through a separation or a divorce. Obviously at the time, it's extremely stressful and that can go on for long periods of time, but hopefully at some point you do come out the other side and start to obviously get your life back on track, so to speak. Another example would be a bereavement within the family where somebody has passed away. extremely stressful, long periods of time. You've got the funeral to plan, but as time is a great healer, and in time, things start to settle and your body starts to go back to normal. The type of stress that we're looking at with adverse childhood experiences is the third one, which is toxic stress. And that's the one that we're going to be focusing on today. And that was the one that we just experienced when we pretended that the bear was coming out of the woods, when our body started to change in response to the situation. That is extreme stress, it's frequent, and it's extended activation of the body's stress response. And this is the important bit, without the buffering of a supported adult. So this is intense stress. It is basically living in a toxic stress environment every day, because if you're living in a domestic violence abuse situation, you don't know when it's going to happen. If you're living with parents or one parent or both that are indulging in alcohol, obviously to extreme levels, or drug abuse, then that is going to be carrying on. And it doesn't just happen for a couple of weeks. It can be happening for years and years within our households of our young children. That is part of what they are living with on a daily basis. And that is something that is toxic stress, and it actually starts to alter the complete change of the brain and actually the body's response to stress, because it's not something that's going away. It's something that we go back to and experience day in, day out, and it carries on, in the case of some children, sadly for many, many years, that until we reach a threshold sometimes where the child maybe is removed and goes into the looked after system. But as we know, the majority of children, that doesn't happen, and they tend to be staying in that environment for many, many years. It's intense, it's repeated, and it's unaddressed. The families live in that day to day, and it carries on, and it's a cycle that keeps on going. And obviously the supported adult isn't available, because if your supportive adult is your mum or your dad, and you're in an environment where mum is so frightened that maybe dad's going to come home drunk and is going to obviously grab hold of her or grab hold of the children, she is not going to be available in the way that she should be, because she's just trying to keep herself safe. So a child feels they can't go to her because they know that things are really bad and they might upset the apple cart. So they do tend to then feel that there is nobody that they can turn to, and they retreat to their bedrooms half the time to keep their head down low, so that they don't cause any more antagonistic behaviour and upset any more things that are going on within the family. And obviously, that over long periods of time causes really, really big problems. So trauma, what do we know about trauma and how it develops the brain? It has been researched by many neurologists recently and over the last few years. So this isn't anything that is new to us, but it certainly has focused in on the research that Bellis has been producing in Wales, which we'll learn a little bit more about in the next couple of minutes. So what happens is at the moment you're all nicely at rest, you're all feeling relaxed, looking forward to your holidays, and you haven't got any children sort of in the school system, so we're all quite feeling okay. So suddenly then, if something happened and our years took us to a loud bang, or something happening sort of in the area with smoke coming up, straight away we would perceive that as being there's something going on, and everybody's eye would look to the window to see what was going on. So there would be some type of threat, a bit like the bear that we saw in the woods. Straight away your body thinks that there's a threat for some reason. Could be a loud noise, could be something out of the ordinary, but it gives us a warning signal in our bodies that something's happening. Chemicals start to flood in. It's that rush of adrenaline, it's that rush of cortisol, which causes your heart to do this, and it causes your stomach to turn, your palms to get sweaty, to start to shake. So that is your body's own natural way of getting those chemicals inside your body to protect you from the perceived threat that might be out there. So you can imagine in situations recently where there have been attacks on sort of the big concert hall up in Manchester, when they started to hear people screaming and running, what did they all do? They all started to run. It's your body's natural response to get you out of a dangerous situation. And basically, you do one of three things. When your body is feeling a threat, you either fight, which a lot of our young children do in schools. You flight, which is certainly very common. You do a runner because you're scared. And sometimes lots of our children do actually freeze as well on the spot, where their brain just goes blank and they can't think. And we now know in all the research is that if a child is living in a toxic stress environment, Their body actually does those 3 things on a daily basis. That is your signal to know. You don't even need to know what the trauma is. You don't need to know what the adverse childhood experience is. Your child in front of you that is displaying a fight, flight and freeze on a very regular basis tells you that somewhere along the way their brain has changed because they are not feeling safe in their environment. That is your cue. So the chemicals flood in. Afterwards, you become exhausted after the threat is gone, and you sort of take a deep breath and things start to settle down. Your body comes back to normal and you go back to rest. What we now know from all the studies in public health and with medical professionals is that our children that live in a toxic stress environment stay in the trauma fixed load all the time. Their body is constantly keeping them safe because they don't feel safe. That adrenaline and cortisol is rushing through at incredible rates all the time. And even though they're safe in the school environment that you're in, it can be any trigger that you might not know that takes them back to being in their bedroom really scared the night before, that can take them straight into a fight, flight and freeze. Child looks at them in the wrong direction, he's staring at me, he's doing this, he's doing that. I'm going to do a runner, or I'm going to fight him. And for some of our children who've experienced sexual abuse, one of the usual ones that they do sadly is they freeze because they get it over with. Because if that's happening to you on a regular basis, if you're being sexually abused by a parent or an adult, supported adult, you learn very quickly that probably you're not going to be able to fight an adult. Sometimes there is nowhere to flight to from your bedroom. Where can you go if you're a child? So then what tends to be the response that those children do, sadly, in those situations is they do tend to freeze because they get it over with and they know it's coming and they know there's nothing else that they can do. So we need to be mindful of not just our children that are fight and flighting, but we do need to be mindful of the ones that are very quiet, very hypervigilant, and that will freeze when you ask them a question, because that's their body's way of protecting them, which gives you a link as to why they feel the need to be protected, because obviously there is something going on. Toxic stress from trauma, we now know, overdevelops the life-preserving part of the brain. These children constantly feel they have to keep themselves safe. They constantly feel that there's a threat around every corner, so they constantly overdevelops that bit and they get stuck in that trauma response every day of their lives. Very, very stressful. It's bad enough, isn't it, when we're out in the car and maybe somebody ran out in front of you, you slam your brakes on, your heart suddenly stops and you do this. Oh, gosh, can you imagine that that is going on for some of our children? That constant rush of adrenaline and cortisol, which makes you all upset and shaken up, is going on a daily basis all the time. It's not good, is it? It's not helpful. We don't like feeling it ourselves, so how on earth are they going to manage within the school structure when that is going on? Picture there of the brain. We know that the critical years make a difference. If anybody's done attachment sort of background and attachment work, you know that the first 2 years is when a baby is making secure attachments with a parent, an adult. There's a reciprocal relationship between the baby cries and an adult will come and look after me. They will either feed me, change my nappy, or they will rock me, or they will soothe me. And that is a secure attachment with an adult. But if that adult isn't available because there is a lot of toxic stress in the environment, then that baby can often be crying for long periods and their needs are not being attended to, which is where we have certain attachment styles that come in which are not secure attachments because the adult hasn't been there for them. So in the first 2 years, children's brains are growing from 25% to 80% of the adult size. That is when all the pathways are joining together, when the brain is making connections. This is also, most interestingly, I think, this is what is happening where the child, even at that first 2 years, is starting to learn empathy for others. Starting to learn that if I hurt somebody, they might cry, or if somebody hurts me, I might cry. It's the very early stages of somebody actually learning to be empathetic. And that is when the child also learns to trust that the adult is going to meet their needs. When I cry in the pram or the cot, somebody will come to me. Obviously, we know in the cases of neglect that we have babies in cots that can be crying for hours and the adult is not available for them, that they are not having a nappy change, that they are not being soothed, and then that starts to cause really big problems. So that trust is then lost because the adult is not trustworthy person that's going to come to them. And obviously they start then to lose trust later on in life in the whole community around them. Why should anybody trust a community when their own parent hasn't given them what they needed? How on earth are they going to trust an adult that they don't actually know?
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two, from eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things building sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation, can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport, all those planes landing and taking off, and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead, and remember and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their mind. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
It's all about relationships, which is why I said when I started that what we obviously going to bring to the school is not a new initiative or a new intervention that you can tick the box. It is all about how you build up your relationships, because we now know that we can't take away the adversity that some of our children are facing, but what we can do is give them some resilient skills so that they're able to have some tools in their bag to get them out of certain situations. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, which are stressful experiences that occur during childhood that directly harm a child. For example, sexual or physical abuse, or they affect the environment in which they live. For example, growing up in a house with domestic violence. This is from Professor Bellis, who works for Public Health, who's done some research which we're going to talk about in a moment, and this was from 2016. The three pieces of research that have been done in Wales, in our country, we're quite at the forefront of this at the moment, is the first research piece that he did was on adverse childhood experiences and the impact on their health-harming behaviours to the Welsh adult population. So he looked at ACEs in people's childhood, and then he actually then looked at these people as adults, and he then went on to look at the connections between whether they indulge in alcohol to a level that's obviously increased, or whether they are regularly taking drugs. Any other self-harming could also be overeating, anything to compensate gone on in their life. The second research was basically the association with mental well-being and ACEs. And there's no surprise to know that if you've got ACEs in your childhood, you tend to have poorer mental health as an adult and less skills to be able to develop yourself and make yourself well. And the third piece of research that was then done is he linked between adverse childhood experiences and the association with chronic disease and the health service, which is why we are now in a public health crisis that you see on the news every day, with people spilling into casualty departments, huge increases in what we are dealing with in our hospitals. And lo and behold, the research tells us that lots of this is linked to actually adverse childhood experiences, which I think is quite sort of explosive to think about. So he went and he did a research on the 9 ACEs that we talk about. 3 are child maltreatment, verbal abuse, physical abuse and sexual abuse. The other 6 are actually the environment in which the child lives. So there's parental separation, domestic violence, mental illness, alcohol abuse, drug use and incarceration. So he went and he did a survey of the Welsh population just 2 years ago, people between the ages of 18 to 69, and he actually looked at what had gone on in their childhood, and they actually did an ACE score as to whether they'd experienced one of these 9 ACEs. And obviously this was the figures that we came out with. Verbal abuse, 23% had experienced that as a child. Physical abuse, 17%, and sexual abuse, 10%. Then when we looked at the household, in the survey, bear in mind this was a cross-section, it's not everybody in Wales, but it was quite a large population study. 20% had experienced a parent divorcing, 16% had experienced domestic violence. Incarceration would be an adult that had ended up a parent in prison, which was just 5%. Drug use is 5%. When we've taken this out to the MyState cluster of schools, they laughed. They said, 5%? You are joking. You know, there is no way that's reflective of our areas in which we live in. But obviously this was a cross-section across Wales, from the leafy suburbs to much more deprived areas. And what happened is, because the survey is up to the age of 69, you can imagine when they interviewed adults that were in their 60s, whether they'd experienced drug use in their families, that wouldn't have been so much of an issue back 60 years ago that we're seeing what's happening today. So the reason why the drug use is so low is because of the actual population that they surveyed, and the people in their 60s and 65 to 69, obviously when they look back at their childhood, drugs weren't such a big issue. There were other problems, there were other things going on, but the drug use that we are seeing in our Welsh society at the moment and communities was not the biggest issue at that point. The Welsh study looked at, for every 100 adults in Wales, 47 have suffered at least one ACE during their childhood. I'm sure as you were looking at those 9 ACEs there, you were thinking, oh, I've had that one, or I've had that one. And this is normal. What we're saying is ACEs aren't a bunch of children in this category here. They are us. They are us. We have got ACEs. You might sit there and you might be one of the lucky ones that haven't got any ACEs at all, which is great. But what you find in lots of adults is we do all have, sadly, some adult adverse childhood experiences in some shape or form. If you think about 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce, divorce and separation is one adverse childhood experience. It doesn't have to cause major issues. It depends on how toxic the breakdown has been. We do have, we're not saying that, you know, that if you're a bad parent, if you've divorced and you're a single parent, what we're saying is, if you've handled that in a really positive way, and the children feel happy and secure in the fact that there's been a separation, that could cause no problems at all. But what we're saying is the biggest problem with that particular ACE would be where there's a very, very sort of nasty breakdown and it causes major, major problems. So obviously 0% of this study of every 100 adults, 53% no ACEs whatsoever. 20% had 1 ACE, 2 to 3 ACEs was 13%, and actually 4 plus ACEs in this particular study, 14% of that study, or 100 adults, that actually had 4 or more ACEs. And these are the sad statistics that go with that. ACEs are across everywhere. So poverty, what happens is poverty means that the children have less resilience in order to overcome adversity. So poverty isn't one. But obviously, what we found is that it impacts greatly, because the poverty, as another sort of side that goes in, also increases risks as well. But obviously, that wasn't part of the survey, but it certainly is linked with developing resilience in later on life. If you're in a poverty-type deprivation background, you've got less chance of making it, basically, as well. So all the odds are stacked against you. They then looked at the increased risks. So compared with people with no ACEs at all in the study in Wales 2 years ago, if they'd had 4 adverse childhood experiences, these are their chances. Really quite shocking. 20 times more likely to end up in prison in their lifetime if they've had 4 ACEs in their childhood. They are 16 times more likely to end up using crack cocaine or heroin. 11 times more likely to smoke cannabis. 4 times more likely to be a high-risk drinker, 15 times more likely to have committed violence against a person, and 14 times more likely to be an actual victim of violence. So obviously those are quite huge risks that we need to be taking on board and looking at the patterns that some of our children might end up. And we're not saying this is a pattern and this is a road that they will invariably go on. We're saying this is the increased risks. Then they looked at ACEs with a link with mental well-being. Again, really sad. 6 times more likely to have never felt useful. So if they've had 4 or more ACEs as an adult, they are 4 times more likely to never or rarely think clearly. Their head is in a fuzz most of the time. They can't find the way out of the problems, which is why they tend to be the families that we find the hardest to engage with in school structures when things are difficult, because they've got negative experiences of school themselves very often, negative experiences of a lack of trust in the school system themselves. So why on earth would they want to come in and try and trust us with helping them when maybe the whole system has failed them? 5 times more likely to never make up their mind about things. So they tend to really be just floating, and they can't really make any sort of firm decisions on their life plans or obviously the path that they would like to go on. And then this is probably, I think, the most shocking, which links with why public health are closely involved in the work that we are doing. They then looked at those, actually, the link between ACEs and diseases. Up to the age of 69 years, if you've 4 or more ACEs, you are twice more likely than those with no ACEs to be diagnosed with one of these chronic diseases. So there is a huge link. The toxic stress in your brain as a child changes your body and makes you more susceptible in later on life to having some of these illnesses. You are 4 times more likely to develop diabetes type 2, 3 times more likely to develop heart disease, and 3 times more likely to develop a respiratory disease. Over a 12-month period, they compared to people with no ACEs. Those with 4 or more ACEs were twice more likely to have frequently visited the GP. By frequently, they visited the GP at least 6 or more times in a year. I never get to the doctors. I'm lucky if I go once every 5 years. They don't know me. I haven't really got time to go to the doctors. But I'm quite healthy and fit. But you can imagine you going to the GP once every 2 months over something or other. 3 times more likely to have ended up in A&E, and 3 times more likely to have stayed overnight in hospital. So you can see the link between children's adverse childhood experiences goes on in adults to actually link to some of the things that we see in the increase of in hospitals at the moment. I'm just going to finish today with a short animation for you and then some questions.
My parents don't understand. All the drinking and fighting means I'm scared. I'd like a cuddle, perhaps a bedtime story, but mostly I'd like them to stop shouting at me, and sometimes they hit me. Feeling scared every day and not feeling loved or wanted will change me for the rest of my life. Later, I'll have problems with school, problems with alcohol and I'll get in trouble with the police. What's happening to me right now means I'm more likely to have serious health problems in middle age and die sooner than I should. Doctors say my life is full of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. But in my world, this means I see my dad hitting my mum. Dad's got a drinking problem, and mum's always crying, even with the tablets. I'm always being shouted at and hit. After the booze and fags, there's not a lot of money for toys or clothes, or even food. I'm getting used to being scared all the time, but now I'm just angry. Doctors say things are changing inside me. My brain isn't learning how to control my feelings properly. My body can't relax like those kids who don't have ACEs, so my body won't be able to repair itself properly when I get older, making it more likely I'll get cancer or heart disease as an adult. It hurts when my parents hit me, but the real damage is hidden, and that damage will be with me for life.
I drink and smoke. They say I'm out of control, but I'm not. It's just my way of coping with my ACEs. I've been in plenty of fights, but what's wrong with that? Kids' punches don't hit half as much as when my dad hits me. I beat up a kid last week at school because he looked at me weird. Who cares? I ended up with more time out of school. Learning's not for me anyway, and the teachers don't care any more than my parents. I don't like the way anyone looks at me except my girl. She's 16 and pregnant, just like my mum was with me.
So this is where I've ended up. I've got diabetes and cancer is probably on the way. I know these kill you, but I couldn't do without them. I've never had a proper job and I've spent time inside. I hit my kids. I hit their mum too, until she left. So my kids have grown up with ACEs. And now my daughter had her first kid. She's 16. The course of my life was set in the wrong direction a long time ago. I know where I'm heading, and sadly I know where my kids are heading too. This doesn't have to happen. A little help in childhood makes a big difference to where life takes you. When I was a baby, the nurses noticed that my mum wasn't coping and helped her and explained how important my childhood is to the rest of my life. So, with a bit of help, she coped. The police came round after next door complained about the noise from Mum and Dad fighting. They asked how I was feeling. I told them I was scared all the time. Mum and Dad got help, the shouting got better and the hitting stopped. I even got some bedtime stories. I still had problems at school, but the teacher asked me about what was happening at home. I got help controlling my feelings. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. I'm now married with 2 children and I've got a job. Most of the time. I haven't repeated the same problems with my kids. We got help when being a parent got too much. Our children are ACE-free, and that means their kids stand a good chance of growing up ACE-free as well. Almost half the people in England and Wales experienced 1 ACE as a child, and 1 in 10 of us suffered 4 or more ACEs. If we stop ACEs, millions of children would not become smokers or binge drinkers, and levels of violence in adults would be cut in half. Fewer ACEs in childhood also means fewer adults developing diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes in middle age. We all need to be ACE aware. Are you? Doctors, police, nurses, teachers, firefighters, and most importantly, parents. The more you know about ACEs, the more you can help stop children growing up with ACEs in their lives. And for those of you who have already suffered ACEs, the more you know, the more you can help yourself and others who have suffered ACEs cope.
So basically what it shows is obviously is one child's journey through childhood who's experiencing domestic violence in the household, and how that starts to alter the brain because of the build-up of toxic stress, and how he then goes on to behave as a teenager, and how he then goes on to behave as an adult. And basically it just shows that intergenerational vicious cycle that we see that goes on, that what happens as a childhood then goes on to affect you as an adult, and you end up making the same mistakes, and the cycle carries on happening all over again. And basically what happens is the positive bit at the end, because it's quite obviously a depressing picture so far, which I don't want you to leave you on today, is the end bit of the video actually shows that he has some support. The trusted adult ends up being somebody in the school structure that actually pays attention to him and listens to him, and they then start to access some early help for the family, and things start to alter, and then that child obviously goes on to break that cycle. So that's what the cartoon or the video is showing you. It's been made by Professor Bellis, who's the gentleman that's done the study in Wales. You might be sitting there thinking now, well, this is a really depressing picture. What does this mean for us? Well, the second half of this then goes on to what this looks like on a daily basis in the school structure, what these children present with. And as you all know, I'm sure, is every form of behaviour is a communication. So when children are what we seem to think pressing our buttons and obviously doing the things that we don't want them to be doing on a day-to-day basis in school, it helps us to understand that they are communicating something to us, and the fact of their behaviours that they're presenting with is our cue to know that they are basically the children that press your buttons the most are the ones that need your help the most. Is the message behind this. They are the ones that are desperate for some adult somewhere to give them that positive relationship, because what the study has now gone on to do recently in the last few years is looked at the protective factors that enable our children to overcome adversity. And the main protective factors that help us overcome adversity are a strong, stable adult in our lives, somebody that will actually listen to us and give us some choices and be there for us. And it's interesting that in the school structure, be that adult obviously, and I know most of you have probably got somebody that you've got in mind already that you think that is probably crying out for help, that is coming to you maybe on a daily basis, that relationship with you. And obviously, sometimes all that child will be wanting is somebody just to listen to them, and we need to stop thinking about what's wrong with you and start asking, well, what's happened to you? Because we now know that if those presenting behaviours of fight, flight and freeze are there all the time, that is our cue to know that something really toxic stress environments is happening for that child on a daily basis. And it's our job in schools, obviously, to start asking maybe some difficult questions and be there with a really sort of empathetic manner in the way that we deal with our young children that obviously are experiencing adverse childhood experiences on a day-to-day basis. The next step of this then is the EPs come in and we start to look at making your school a trauma-informed practice where you are going to be the trusted adult and you are going to hopefully build up a really supportive environment within your school to nurture the children that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis.